Incredible. Okay, let's come back to the UK then, Charles, and policing.
Policing, indeed. I will take you back to the aftermath of the 7th of October last year and the interventions from the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, which looked very much like they ran roughshod over the notion of operational independence of police, with her taking what looked like a very one-sided approach to responses of protest demonstrations and the like all over the United Kingdom. Now, just last week, James Cleverly finally got round to responding to the State of Policing 2022 report, the most significant detail of which was to refer to new powers for His Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, specifically granting HMIC the power to direct forces, which is a significant new power. Such a power would need a proper system of accountability to accompany it, and then he reminds the Inspectorate that he already holds powers under Section 40 of the Police Act 1996 to intervene where a force or local policing body is failing. So whilst that looks clear-cut, it is in fact at the beginnings of lines being very blurred, and I'll go on to explain what I mean by that, because if we look at the Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services website, which has not been updated because it's not yet clear how these powers will actually take effect. So they state at the moment that they're an inspectorate and not a regulator, and that inspectorates have powers to secure information, but no powers to give orders for change. And they go on to remind us that it's for chief constables, whose operational independence is a cornerstone of British policing, to effectively make decisions about all matters operational, as well as what they do with the recommendations. Now, what's worth going back to is the original report from the Inspectorate, which is, as I say, dated 2022. And specifically, their recommendations are that the Chief Inspector of Constabulary should be provided with the power to give directions in relation to a police force in cases where an inspection identifies a failing that poses a significant risk to public safety. So I'd like you to bear that in mind, specifically the reference to public safety. We then see how mission creep can affect itself in the second paragraph, where we talk about limited circumstances being the case in which further power should be provided to give direction to the NPCC. Now, I submitted a Freedom of Information request at the Home Office to ask about meetings between police chiefs and the Home Secretary during the period of COVID restrictions that year. And I was sent, as part of the reply, a letter which was about the COVID enforcement strategy. And you'll see that it's signed not least by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, but also by Martin Hewitt. So in effect, they had teamed up, and it looks very much like the purpose of doing so was to attempt to get around the issue of operational independence. In that letter, they quite clearly state that this period will undoubtedly be challenging. So with your input, we have jointly developed a COVID-19 police enforcement strategy to meet these challenges and target resources. Now, that sounds to me very much like the Home Office is giving operational direction to police. They go on to say that they agree that police activity should be weighted towards those areas where infection rates are most acute, and they talk about heightened visibility and patrols and priorities placed on areas with highest rates of infection. That is, without doubt, meddling in the operational affairs of police constables. So we go further into this by looking at the minutes of meetings from the Chief Constable's meetings back in that period. And in January, before all this nonsense started, they talk about policing having funding for uplift, but it won't be the solution to other challenges such as public safety. But of course, by June of 2020, they're talking about the government being very closely engaged in policing and having a number of demands that they want policing to deliver on. Again, further interference. But of course, because it fell under the banner of COVID, it would appear that anything went. By July, we see that it's actually a two-way street, and the chiefs discussed new legislation being implemented. This is about wearing face coverings. And they requested more engagement with government to reinforce viewpoints on the right level of intervention. So the direction that this could go in is very alarming, and particularly I take you back to what was said about public safety, because that's really at the heart of this. And public safety, obviously, in this context, is meant to mean a sort of a health emergency. But of course, it can include censorship, it could include extremism, it could even now include the spectre of war. And so, just to remind you of exactly how these things can go wrong, we'll look at again, just go back to the House of Commons Library briefing on enforcing COVID restrictions. And it's always worth noting that lockdown restriction enforcement was an operational matter for the police. This means police leaders, not national or local politicians, decided whether and how to deploy their officers to lockdown enforcement. So it's very clear from that the Home Secretary had absolutely no business meddling in the affairs of the police chiefs, the police forces, any of those bodies, to dictate exactly how they should deploy their resources, use their funding, any of those sorts of things. And yet we've seen it happen. So to go back to the possible change whereby the Inspector of Constabulary is granted new powers to direct police forces with public safety in mind, it sets a very alarming precedent. And Mike, I don't know if you've got any particular thoughts on it, perhaps regarding sort of censorship and extremism, but the direction of travel does not seem to be the right one.
No, and the Inspectorate of Constabulary is there to assess the role that the police are playing, and are they fulfilling their obligations. Once we start getting politicians telling them what they're supposed to be enforcing, Absolutely. That becomes extremely dangerous. And, we see this as being another regulatory regime being built alongside Ofcom, MHRA, and a whole bunch of other regulators that are not there, in fact, for public safety. It's for the safety of the government, as far as I can see. But anyway, let's